The woman stumbled into Stockton, California, on a blistering August afternoon in 1879, her dress stained with dust and sweat. One hand pressed protectively against her swollen belly, as if shielding a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. Benjamin Anders had been shoeing a mare outside the livery stable when he first saw her, and something in the desperate way she moved made him set down his tools and cross the sun-bleached street without thinking. She looked ready to collapse, her dark hair escaping from its pins, her face flushed with heat and exhaustion. He caught her elbow just as her knees buckled, steadying her with hands that were calloused but surprisingly gentle. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and calm like he was settling a spooked horse. "When did you last eat?" She looked up at him with eyes the color of storm clouds, and he saw fear there, raw and immediate. Her free hand went to her belly again, that protective gesture that told him everything and nothing at once. She was maybe 6 months along, he figured, though he was no expert on such matters. What he did know was that she was alone, frightened, and trying very hard not to show it. "I don't have any money," she whispered, and her voice cracked on the last word. Benjamin shook his head. "Didn't ask if you did. Asked when you ate last." "Yesterday morning, maybe, I'm not sure anymore." He guided her toward the boarding house at the end of Main Street, one hand still at her elbow, moving slow enough that she could keep pace. The few people on the street watched with undisguised curiosity, and he could already hear the whispers starting. Stockton was a decent-sized town, grown prosperous from the mining trade and the railroad that had come through 5 years back, but it was still small enough that a pregnant woman arriving alone would be the talk of every parlor and saloon by sundown. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house, met them at the door with her arms crossed and her mouth set in a disapproving line. She was a widow of 45 with iron-gray hair and opinions to match, and Benjamin knew exactly what she was thinking when she looked at the woman's bare ring finger and swollen belly. "Mrs. Henderson," he said before she could speak, "this lady needs a room and a hot meal. I'll cover the cost." "Benjamin Anders, I run a respectable establishment, and I'm asking you to show some Christian charity. She's exhausted and hungry, and that's all that matters right now." The woman beside him stiffened, pride warring with desperation on her face. "I don't need charity, I can work. I'm good with numbers, and I can sew, and I'm stronger than I look." Mrs. Henderson's expression softened slightly at that, though her mouth remained tight. "What's your name, girl?" Rose Jackson. You married Rose Jackson." The silence stretched out long enough that Benjamin felt compelled to fill it. "That's her business and none of ours. Now are you going to feed her, or do I need to take her somewhere else?" Mrs. Henderson sniffed but stepped aside. "Room 4 upstairs. Dinner's at 6. You'll eat with the other boarders and you'll conduct yourself properly. And Benjamin Anders, you'll be paying weekly in advance." "Fair enough." He turned to Rose, who was looking at him like she couldn't quite figure out what to make of him. "You'll be safe here, Mrs. Henderson's bark is worse than her bite." "I heard that, young man. Meant you to." He tipped his hat to Rose. "Welcome to Stockton, Miss Jackson. If you need anything, the livery stable's just across the street. I'm there most days." He left before she could thank him, before he could think too hard about why he'd just committed to paying for a stranger's room and board. There was something about her, something in the set of her shoulders and the way she'd said she was stronger than she looked, that made him believe it. Made him want to help her prove it. That evening, as the sun painted the Sierra Nevada foothills gold and crimson, Benjamin sat on the porch of the boarding house and whittled a piece of pine into something that might eventually resemble a horse. He told himself he was just enjoying the cool evening air, not waiting to see if Rose would come down for dinner, but when the door opened and she emerged in a clean dress, someone must have loaned her, her hair brushed and pinned properly. He felt something shift in his chest. She hesitated when she saw him, then came to sit on the steps a respectful distance away. "Thank you for what you did today. I'll pay you back every cent. It might take a while, but I will. No rush." He kept his eyes on his whittling. "How are you feeling?" "Better, Mrs. Henderson is kinder than she lets on. She had one of the other women bring up a basin of water and some clothes that might fit." Rose was quiet for a moment, then added, "You didn't ask." "Ask what?" "About the baby. About why I'm alone." Benjamin looked at her then, really looked at her. In the dying light, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, probably no more than 22 or 23. His own 26 years suddenly felt ancient by comparison. "Figured if you wanted to tell me, you would. If you don't, that's your right." Most people wouldn't see it that way. Most people worry too much about things that aren't their concern. He returned to his whittling. "You planning to stay in Stockton?" "I don't have anywhere else to go." The admission seemed to cost her something, and she looked away quickly. "I came from Sacramento. Before that, San Francisco. Before that doesn't matter anymore." There was a story there, he knew, and probably not a pleasant one, but he'd meant what he said about not asking. Everyone who came west was running from something or towards something, and the difference didn't matter much in the end. What mattered was what you did once you got here. "Stockton's a good town," he said. "Growing fast. Lots of opportunity for someone willing to work hard. Even for someone like me, for anyone." He folded his knife and pocketed it, then held up the half-carved horse for inspection. "What do you think? Going to make it into something, or should I just use it for kindling?" Rose smiled, small but genuine, and it transformed her whole face. "I think it has potential. You just have to be patient with it." Over the next few weeks, Benjamin found himself being patient with a lot of things. He continued paying for Rose's room, waving off her protests with the explanation that he had more money than he knew what to do with anyway, which wasn't entirely true, but wasn't entirely false either. He'd been saving for years, working long hours at the livery and taking on odd jobs around town, building up a nest egg for a future he'd never quite defined. Helping Rose felt like as good a use for that money as any. She found work with the seamstress on 2nd Street, a French woman named Madame Leroux, who needed help with the endless stream of orders from the town's growing population. Rose's claim about being good with a needle proved accurate, and soon she was bringing in enough money to insist on paying for her own meals, if not her room. Benjamin noticed she was careful with every penny, setting aside what she could in a little cloth purse she kept hidden in her room. They fell into a pattern, the two of them. Most evenings after work, they'd sit on the boarding house porch and talk while the town settled into darkness around them. She told him about growing up in San Francisco, the daughter of a shipping clerk who died when she was 15, leaving her mother to take in laundry to make ends meet. She talked about her love of books and how she'd once dreamed of becoming a teacher. She told him about her mother's death 2 years ago and the desperate loneliness that had followed. What she didn't tell him was about the baby's father, and Benjamin never asked. He told her about his own past, about growing up on a ranch in Texas, the youngest of 4 brothers. How he'd left home at 18 with nothing but a horse and $50, determined to make his own way. He'd worked as a ranch hand, a deputy sheriff for a wild 6 months in Nevada, and finally settled in Stockton when he realized he'd found a place that felt like it could be home. He talked about his love of horses, how he could read their moods better than most people's, and how he'd been saving to buy his own stable someday. "Why haven't you?" Rose asked one evening in mid-September, when the heat had finally broken and the air smelled of approaching autumn. Benjamin leaned back against the porch rail, considering. Guess I was waiting for the right time, or maybe the right reason. That seems like a good enough reason on its own, wanting something. Maybe, but some things are better when you have someone to share them with. Rose's hand went to her belly, which had grown more prominent in the weeks since she'd arrived. The baby moved visibly now, and sometimes Benjamin would catch her looking down at it with an expression he couldn't quite read. Love and fear mixed together, maybe, or something more complicated than that. "You ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Not having someone to share things with." "I did. But lately I've been thinking that maybe the right person just hasn't come along yet. Or maybe she has and I'm just figuring it out." Rose looked at him then, and something passed between them, unspoken but understood. She didn't say anything, just held his gaze for a long moment before looking away, her cheeks coloring slightly. The turning point came in early October when Mrs. Henderson's nephew arrived from Sacramento. Frank Henderson was a man of 30-odd years with slicked-back hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He worked as a land speculator, buying up property cheap and selling it dear, and he had opinions about everything and everyone, including Rose. Benjamin was at the livery when he heard the raised voices coming from the boarding house. He dropped the bridle he'd been mending and ran, taking the porch steps 2 at a time. In the parlor, he found Frank Henderson backing Rose into a corner, his finger jabbing toward her pregnant belly. "Women like you are a disgrace," Frank was saying, his voice dripping with contempt. "Flaunting your sin for everyone to see, taking advantage of my aunt's good nature. That's enough." Benjamin's voice cut through the room like a blade, and Frank wheeled around, startled. "This doesn't concern you, Anders." "The hell it doesn't." Benjamin moved to stand between Frank and Rose, his fists clenched at his sides. "You want to talk about taking advantage? Let's talk about that land you sold to the Mitchells last month. Told them it had water rights when you knew damn well it didn't." Frank's face went red. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about, and I know you've got no right to judge anyone, least of all Miss Jackson. Now apologize." "I will do no such thing." Benjamin took a step forward, and something in his expression must have convinced Frank that this wasn't a fight worth having. The land speculator backed toward the door, straightening his jacket with exaggerated dignity. "My aunt will hear about this," he said. "She'll put that woman out on the street where she belongs. Your aunt's got more sense and decency in her little finger than you've got in your whole body. Now get out." After Frank stormed off, Benjamin turned to find Rose pressed against the wall, her arms wrapped around her belly, tears streaming down her face. Without thinking, he closed the distance between them and pulled her into his arms, one hand cradling the back of her head while she sobbed against his chest. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I'm so sorry. He's right, I'm a disgrace, and you've been so kind, and I've brought nothing but trouble." "Stop that," he held her tighter. "You haven't done anything wrong, you hear me? Nothing. You don't understand, the baby, it isn't what you think. I don't care what it is or isn't, I care about you." She pulled back enough to look up at him, her eyes red and swollen. "Why? Why do you care about me?" Benjamin reached up and brushed a tear from her cheek, his thumb lingering against her skin. "Because you're brave. Because you're kind. Because when you smile it feels like the sun coming out. Because I think I've been falling in love with you since the day I saw you walking down Main Street like you were determined to keep going no matter what." Benjamin. His name was barely a whisper on her lips. "You don't have to say anything. I know this is complicated. I know you've got a baby coming, and I know there's a story you haven't told me. But I need you to know that I don't care about any of that. I care about you, and I'll care about that baby, and if you'll let me, I'd like to be here for both of you." Rose's hands came up to grip his shirt, and she looked at him with something like wonder. "I don't deserve you. That's not your decision to make. Now, do you want to tell me about it? About the baby?" She nodded slowly, and they sat down on the settee together. For a long moment, she didn't speak, just stared at her hands folded in her lap. When she finally began, her voice was so quiet he had to lean in to hear. His name was Richard Pemberton. I met him in San Francisco about a year after my mother died. I was working in a dress shop, and he used to come in to buy things for his sisters. At least, that's what he told me. He was handsome and charming, and he said things that made me feel special. Important. He promised me everything. Marriage, a home, a future. Benjamin felt his jaw tighten, but he kept silent and let her continue. I believed him. I was so lonely, and he made me feel less alone. We were going to elope, he said. His family would never approve because I didn't have money or connections, but once we were married, they'd have to accept it. He just needed time to arrange everything. Her voice broke. I was such a fool. You were in love. That doesn't make you a fool. I let him convince me that we were as good as married already, that it was just a formality we were waiting to complete, and I believed him because I wanted to. Because I needed to. She took a shaky breath. When I told him about the baby, he disappeared, just vanished. I went to his house and the servants told me the family had gone to New York. No forwarding address, no message for me, nothing. Benjamin felt a white-hot anger bloom in his chest, directed at a man he'd never met. He abandoned you. He used me. He probably never intended to marry me at all. I was just a diversion, something to amuse himself with while his real life waited for him somewhere else. She finally looked up at Benjamin, her eyes fierce despite the tears. I tried to stay in San Francisco, but everyone knew. The women I worked with, the landlady at my boarding house, everyone. They looked at me like I was diseased, like I'd done something unforgivable. I lost my job and I couldn't find another one. So I went to Sacramento, but it was the same there. And then I came here and I found you, and I've been so afraid that when you knew the truth, you'd look at me the way everyone else does. Benjamin took her hands in his, holding them carefully like they were something precious. Look at me, Rose. Really look at me. Do I look disgusted? Do I look like I'm judging you? She searched his face, and whatever she saw there made fresh tears spill down her cheeks. No. That man who left you, he's the disgrace. Not you, never you. You're one of the strongest, most courageous women I've ever met. You kept going when most people would have given up. You're working hard to build a life for yourself and your baby. There's no shame in that. There's only strength. The baby won't have a father. The baby will have me if you'll let me. I meant what I said, Rose. I love you. I love you, and I'll love that baby like it's my own, because in every way that matters it will be. Rose let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. You're serious. You're actually serious. Never been more serious about anything in my life. He squeezed her hands gently. Marry me, Rose. Not because you need someone to take care of you, because I know you can take care of yourself, but because I think we could be happy together. Because I think we could build something good. Because I wake up every morning excited to see you, and I go to bed every night thinking about your smile. Because I'm in love with you, and I think maybe you feel something for me too. I do. The words came out in a rush. I feel so much for you that it scares me. You're good and kind and patient, and you make me feel safe for the first time in so long. But Benjamin, I'm damaged goods. People will talk. They'll say terrible things about you for marrying me. Let them talk. I've never given a damn what people think, and I'm not about to start now. He lifted one of her hands to his lips and kissed it gently. Say yes, Rose. Please say yes. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face like she was trying to memorize every detail. Then slowly she smiled. Not the small, careful smile he'd seen before, but a real smile that lit up her whole face. Yes, yes, I'll marry you. Benjamin felt something in his chest expand, warm and bright and overwhelming. He leaned forward and kissed her, soft and careful, mindful of everything she'd been through. She kissed him back, her hands coming up to frame his face, and it felt like a promise, like the beginning of something that would last forever. They were married a week later in a small ceremony at the town church, with Mrs. Henderson serving as witness despite her nephew's objections. The minister, Reverend Clark, was an old man with kind eyes who asked no questions and blessed their union with genuine warmth. Rose wore a simple blue dress that Madame Leroux had altered to accommodate her growing belly, and Benjamin wore his best suit, the one he'd bought years ago for occasions he'd never quite had reason to attend. Mrs. Henderson insisted they have a wedding dinner at the boarding house, and she laid out a spread that included roasted chicken, fresh bread, and an apple pie that was still warm from the oven. A few of Benjamin's friends from the livery came, and several of the women Rose had befriended at the seamstress shop. Even Madame Leroux made an appearance, pressing a package into Rose's hands with instructions not to open it until later. "You are good woman," the French seamstress said firmly. "And this man, he is good man. You will be happy together, I think." After dinner, Benjamin carried Rose's few possessions to the small house he'd been renting on the edge of town. It was only 3 rooms, modest but clean, with a view of the hills and enough space for them to start their life together. Rose stood in the doorway, looking around with an expression he couldn't quite read. "It's not much," he said, suddenly nervous, "but it's ours. And when I buy the stable, we'll get something bigger. It's perfect." She turned to him, and he saw tears in her eyes again, but happy ones this time. "I never thought I'd have this. A home, a husband who loves me, a chance to start over." "This isn't starting over," Benjamin said, pulling her close. "This is just starting. Everything before this was just the prologue." That night they lay together in the bed that was now theirs, Rose's head resting on his chest, his hand splayed gently over her belly. The baby kicked against his palm, and he laughed in wonder. "Strong little thing, isn't it? Takes after its mother," Rose murmured sleepily. "Lucky baby." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "I promise you both I'm going to spend every day making sure you know you're loved, that you're safe, that you belong here with me." Rose tilted her head up to look at him, and in the moonlight streaming through the window he could see the love shining in her eyes. "I know. I've known since the day you caught me on Main Street and asked when I'd last eaten. I've known since you defended me to Mrs. Henderson and sat with me on the porch every evening and never once made me feel like I owed you anything. I've known since you stood up to Frank Henderson and held me while I cried. I love you, Benjamin Anders. I love you so much it feels impossible sometimes." He kissed her then, slow and deep, a promise and a celebration all at once. And when they finally drifted off to sleep, tangled together in the darkness, Benjamin felt a peace he'd never known before. This was what he'd been waiting for. This was home. The months that followed were the happiest of Benjamin's life. He continued working at the livery, but now he came home every evening to a house filled with warmth and light. Rose transformed their modest home with small touches. Curtains she'd sewn herself, wildflowers in a jar on the table, the smell of dinner cooking on the stove. She continued working for Madame Leroux as long as she was able, determined to contribute to their household and build up their savings. In late November, when the baby was due any day, Benjamin finally made an offer on the livery stable. Old Mr. Peterson, who'd owned it for 20 years, was ready to retire and move to San Diego to be near his daughter. They negotiated a fair price, and Benjamin signed the papers with Rose beside him, her hand resting proudly on his arm. "You did it," she said as they walked home that evening, moving slowly to accommodate her bulk. You're a business owner now. We did it, he corrected. None of this would have happened without you. You gave me a reason to stop waiting and start living. The baby came on a cold December night, 3 weeks before Christmas. Benjamin paced the parlor while the midwife and Mrs. Henderson attended to Rose in the bedroom, his heart racing with every cry he heard. When the midwife finally emerged, her face creased in a smile, he nearly collapsed with relief. "You have a son," she announced. "A healthy boy with a good, strong cry, and your wife did beautifully. She's tired, but she's well." Benjamin rushed into the bedroom to find Rose propped up against the pillows, her hair damp with sweat, her face exhausted but radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in the blanket Madame Leroux had given them as a wedding present. Benjamin approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe, and looked down at his son for the first time. The baby was red-faced and wrinkled, his little fists waving in the air, his eyes squeezed shut. He was the most beautiful thing Benjamin had ever seen after his mother. "Want to hold him?" Rose asked softly. "I don't want to hurt him." "You won't. Come here." Benjamin sat carefully on the edge of the bed, and Rose transferred the baby into his arms, showing him how to support the tiny head. The baby's eyes opened briefly, unfocused and dark, and Benjamin felt his heart crack wide open with a love so fierce it took his breath away. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I'm your father, and I promise you I'm going to be the best father I can be. You and your mother, you're my whole world now." Rose leaned against his shoulder, and they sat together like that for a long time, marveling at the miracle they held between them. Finally, Rose spoke. "I was thinking we could name him Thomas, after my father, Thomas Benjamin Anders." "Thomas Benjamin Anders," Benjamin repeated, testing the weight of the name. "It's perfect, he's perfect, you're perfect." He turned to kiss her gently. "Thank you, Rose. Thank you for trusting me, for letting me be part of this. Thank you for loving us," she whispered back. "For loving us both when no one else would." Christmas that year was a simple affair, just the three of them in their small house. Benjamin had cut a small pine tree and brought it inside, and Rose had decorated it with paper ornaments and strings of popcorn. They exchanged modest gifts. Benjamin gave Rose a new set of sewing scissors and a book of poetry she'd mentioned wanting, and Rose gave Benjamin a watch she'd saved for, with their wedding date engraved on the back. But the real gift was sitting together by the fire, watching Thomas sleep in the cradle Benjamin had built with his own hands, feeling the warmth of family and belonging that neither of them had thought they'd ever have. As winter turned to spring and spring to summer, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The livery stable prospered under Benjamin's ownership, and he hired 2 men to help with the work, which gave him more time at home with Rose and Thomas. Rose went back to work part-time for Madame Leroux, bringing Thomas with her in a basket while she sewed. The Frenchwoman doted on the baby, speaking to him in rapid French and declaring him the most handsome child in all of California. The people of Stockton, who had initially whispered about Rose's sudden marriage and the baby born a few months later, gradually accepted them. Benjamin's reputation for honesty and fair dealing helped, as did Rose's quiet dignity and skill. Those who remembered her arrival alone and pregnant either forgot or chose not to mention it, and those who didn't forget found themselves on the receiving end of Benjamin's cold stare and were wise enough to keep their opinions to themselves. On their first anniversary, Benjamin took Rose to the new restaurant that had opened on Main Street, and they had a proper celebration dinner with wine and dessert. Mrs. Henderson watched Thomas for the evening, and for a few hours, they were just a young couple in love, talking and laughing and holding hands across the table like teenagers. "I've been thinking," Benjamin said as they walked home under a sky full of stars, about building us a proper house. Something with a garden for you and space for Thomas to run around. Maybe room for more children if we're blessed with them. Rose stopped walking and turned to face him. More children, if you want them. I know Thomas was hard on you, and if you'd rather just have him, that's fine. But I love being a father, and I'd love to have more babies with you if you're willing. She reached up and cupped his face in her hands. I would love to have more children with you, as many as we're blessed with, because they'd be ours, Benjamin, not just mine, but ours. Created from love, not from lies and false promises. Do you know what a gift that is? He kissed her there on the street, not caring who might see, and when they finally made it home, Mrs. Henderson handed over a sleeping Thomas with a knowing look and left them to their celebration. Their second child, a daughter they named Sarah, was born in the spring of 1881, just as they were moving into the new house Benjamin had built. She had Rose's gray eyes and Benjamin's dark hair, and her older brother was instantly fascinated by her, wanting to help with everything from changing her nappings to feeding her bottles of expressed milk. The house was everything Benjamin had promised, spacious and well built, with a large garden where Rose grew vegetables and flowers, and a barn where Benjamin kept his favorite horses. They had a parlor for entertaining, a proper dining room, and upstairs, 3 bedrooms with plans for more if they needed them. Rose's work as a seamstress evolved into a small business of her own, with women coming to the house for fittings and custom orders. She was known throughout Stockton for her skill and her eye for design, and she took pride in contributing to the family finances even as she cared for their growing children. Thomas grew into a bright, energetic boy who followed his father everywhere, learning about horses and how to run a business. He was 4 years old when he first asked the question that Benjamin and Rose had been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. They were at the dinner table, Sarah in her high chair making a mess of her mashed potatoes, when Thomas looked at his father with serious brown eyes and said, "Papa, why do some of the kids at church say I'm not really your son?" Rose's fork clattered against her plate, and Benjamin felt his stomach drop. But he'd known this day would come, and he'd promised himself he'd handle it with honesty and love. "Come here, son," he said, pushing back his chair. Thomas climbed down from his seat and came to stand beside Benjamin, who pulled the boy onto his lap. "Those kids don't know what they're talking about. You are my son. You're my son because I chose you, because I love you, because I've been your father since before you were born. Do you understand that? But did you make me? Like you and Mama made Sarah." Benjamin glanced at Rose, who had tears streaming down her face but nodded at him to continue. "No, I didn't make you, but that doesn't make you any less mine. Your mama carried you in her belly, and she was so brave and so strong, and then you were born, and I got to be your father. I got to be the man who holds you when you're scared, who teaches you to ride horses, who tucks you in at night and loves you with his whole heart. Being a father isn't just about making babies, Thomas. It's about being there. It's about loving someone so much you'd do anything for them, and that's what you are to me." Thomas thought about this for a moment, his little face scrunched up in concentration. "So you picked me, like picking a puppy." Despite the tension, Benjamin laughed. "Yeah, buddy, exactly like that. I picked you and your mama, and it was the best decision I ever made." "Okay." Thomas seemed satisfied with this explanation and wriggled down to return to his dinner. "Can I have more chicken?" Rose let out a shaky laugh, wiping at her tears. "Yes, sweetheart, you can have more chicken." Later that night, after the children were asleep, Rose and Benjamin lay in bed holding each other. "Do you think he really understands?" Rose asked. "He understands that he's loved. That's what matters. The rest we can explain as he gets older." Benjamin stroked her hair gently, And if anyone gives him trouble about it, they'll have to answer to me, my fierce protector." She kissed his jaw. "Have I told you lately that you're the best man I've ever known? You might have mentioned it a time or two, but I never get tired of hearing it." Their third child, another boy they named James, was born in 1883, completing their family. The house rang with laughter and noise, with the sound of children playing and learning and growing. Benjamin's stable was now the most successful in Stockton, and he'd expanded to include a freight business that transported goods between the town and San Francisco. Rose's sewing business continued to thrive, and she'd taken on an apprentice, a young woman named Martha who reminded her of herself at that age, alone and struggling, but determined to make something of herself. On quiet Sunday afternoons, when the children were napping or playing in the garden, Benjamin and Rose would sit together on the porch of their beautiful house and watch the sun set over the hills. They'd talk about their week, about their dreams for the future, about how blessed they felt to have found each other. "You ever think about him?" Benjamin asked once, the only time he'd ever brought up Richard Pemberton, Thomas's biological father. Rose was quiet for a moment, then shook her head. "No, not anymore. He's a ghost from another life. You're the only father Thomas has ever known or will ever need. You're the only man I want, the only man I love. That other life, that other Rose, she's gone. I'm the woman you made me, the woman you loved into being, and I'm happier than I ever imagined possible." Benjamin pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling the solid warmth of her body against his. "I love you, Rose Anders. I've loved you from the moment I saw you stumbling down Main Street like you were daring the world to stop you. And I'll love you until the day I die and every day after that, if there's such a thing." "There is such a thing," Rose said with certainty. "Because what we have, it's too strong to end. It's forever, Benjamin. You and me and our children and whatever comes next. It's forever." Years passed, measured in birthdays and Christmases, in first days of school and lost teeth, in scraped knees and bedtime stories. Thomas grew tall and strong, with his mother's intelligence and his father's way with horses. He took over more and more of the stable work as he got older, showing a natural aptitude for business that made Benjamin proud. Sarah was quiet and thoughtful, with a love of books that rivaled her mother's. She could often be found curled up in the window seat Rose had insisted they build, lost in whatever story she was reading. James was the wild one, always climbing trees or getting into mischief, but with a heart of gold and a grin that could charm his way out of any trouble. In 1891, when Thomas was 12 years old and starting to ask more questions about his origins, Benjamin and Rose sat him down for a longer conversation. They told him everything, about Richard Pemberton, about how Rose had been alone and afraid when she came to Stockton, about how Benjamin had fallen in love with both of them and chosen to be a family. Thomas listened quietly, his young face serious. When they finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Do you think he ever thinks about me?" "The man who left, I don't know, son," Benjamin answered honestly. "But if he does, I hope he thinks about what he lost, because he lost something precious. He lost you. I'm glad he left." Thomas looked at both his parents with fierce certainty. "Because if he hadn't, you and Mama wouldn't have met, and you wouldn't be my papa. And I want you to be my papa. You're the best papa in the world." Benjamin felt his throat tighten with emotion, and Rose was crying again, the way she always did during important family moments. He pulled Thomas into a tight hug, this boy who was his son in every way that mattered, and said, "You're the best son in the world, Thomas. I'm so proud of you. So proud of the man you're becoming." From that day forward, they never spoke of Richard Pemberton again. He was a footnote in their family history, nothing more. What mattered was the family they'd built, strong and loving and real. As the century turned and the Old West gave way to a new modern age, the Anders family continued to prosper. Benjamin and Rose watched with satisfaction as their children grew into fine young adults. Thomas married a sweet-natured girl named Elizabeth, and they gave Benjamin and Rose their first grandchild in 1898. Sarah became a teacher, fulfilling Rose's old dream in her own way, and married a newspaperman from Sacramento. James eventually settled down, took over the freight business, and married a firebrand of a woman who could drive a team of horses as well as any man. Through it all, Benjamin and Rose remained each other's anchor and joy. They grew old together, their hair graying, lines forming around their eyes from years of laughter. They sat on their porch on summer evenings, holding hands like newlyweds, watching their grandchildren play in the garden Rose still tended with loving care. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party that seemed to include half of Stockton. There were speeches and toasts, laughter and music, and at one point, Benjamin pulled Rose aside to the quiet of the garden. "I want to show you something," he said, leading her to a bench they'd placed under an old oak tree years ago. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small carved horse, the same one he'd been whittling the night they first really talked. "Remember this." Rose took it carefully, running her fingers over the smooth wood. Over the years, he'd finished it, adding details and polish until it was a beautiful little sculpture. "You kept it all this time." "Of course I did. You told me it had potential, that I just had to be patient with it." "You were right, about the horse and about us and about everything." He took her hands in his. 25 years ago, I watched a woman walk into my life carrying a secret and a baby and more courage than anyone I'd ever met. And I made a choice to love her, to love them both, without questions or conditions. It's the best choice I ever made, Rose. The only choice that ever really mattered. Rose leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together under the oak tree, listening to the sounds of their family celebrating inside. "I love you, Benjamin Anders. Thank you for catching me when I was falling. Thank you for never asking about things that didn't matter. Thank you for loving us both from the very beginning." "Always," he promised, kissing the top of her head. "Always and forever." They stayed that way until the sun set completely and their grandchildren came looking for them, calling out in the darkness that it was time for cake. They went back inside together, hand in hand, the way they'd walked through life for 25 years and would continue to walk for all the years to come. Thomas, now a grown man with children of his own, stood to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass. "Papa, you taught me that being a father has nothing to do with blood and everything to do with choice. You chose me when you didn't have to, and you loved me as your own from the day I was born. That's a gift I can never repay. Mama, you taught me that strength comes in many forms and that starting over isn't the same as giving up. You both taught me what love really means: sacrifice, patience, acceptance, and joy. You built something beautiful out of what could have been tragedy, and you showed all of us what a real family looks like. So here's to you, to 25 years of marriage, and to all the years still to come." Everyone raised their glasses and cheered, and Benjamin looked at Rose with eyes full of love. She smiled back at him, that same smile that had captured his heart all those years ago on a dusty street in Stockton. And he knew that every moment, every choice, every challenge had been worth it. They had built a life together, the cowboy who never asked, and the woman carrying a baby she couldn't explain. They had built love from uncertainty, family from loneliness, and happiness from despair. They had proved that the circumstances of the past didn't have to define the possibilities of the future, and that love, real love, could overcome anything. In the end, that was all that mattered. Not how they'd started, but where they'd ended up. Together, surrounded by children and grandchildren, blessed beyond measure and more in love than ever. It was a story that would be told in their family for generations. The story of how Benjamin Anders saw a woman who needed help and offered his heart instead of his judgment, and how Rose Jackson found the courage to accept it. It was a story about love in its purest form, unconditional, accepting, and everlasting. It was a story about family, about choosing each other day after day, year after year. It was a story about the Old West, about building something new in a harsh land, about finding home in another person's eyes. And it was a story with the best possible ending. They lived happily ever after together.